As you all know, Venezuela has been in a lot of problems lately. Venezuela has been ruled by a socialist dictator, Nicolas Maduro, since 2013. Since then, economic situation has been just catastrophic. People are starving. Inflation has reached the highest in the world. In 2019, the inflation has reached a staggering 2.6 million%. So of course, there's been a lot of protests in Venezuela protesting dictator Maduro. Some estimate that there were up to 1 million people in the biggest anti-Maduro protest. On January 29th, opposition leader Juan Guaido took a public oath to serve as the interim president of Venezuela. More than 50 governments already recognized Guaido as a president of Venezuela, including the United States and most of the Western European countries. Some of the countries that still don't recognize Guaido as the president are Russia, China, Mexico, and other communist dictatorships in the Latin Americas such as Cuba and Nicaragua. But recently, there's been a lot of violence in Venezuela between the people who support opposition and Maduro's government. And because of that, Guaido has called on other nations in the world to consider all measures in fighting President Maduro. International pressure against Maduro is building after opposition led to bring aid to Venezuela has been descended into deadly violence on Saturday. At least 2 people protesting have died in the clashes with Venezuela's troops loyal to Nicolas Maduro. Maduro himself has blocked all aid deliveries from entering Venezuela. Mike Pompeo has condemned the violence by Maduro's thugs and also saying that the US is prepared to take action. Also, President Trump has not yet ruled out an armed response to violence happening in Venezuela. The European Union also condemned the violence in Venezuela. Guaido, an opposition leader, insists that the humanitarian aid is necessary for the citizens of Venezuela, while Maduro is saying that this aid is a ploy by the United States to invade the country. Since 2015, due to disastrous economic situation, 2.7 million have fled Venezuela, most of them going to neighboring Colombia, whose leadership has been helping Venezuela opposition since the protests have begun. But anyway, this is a very complex situation. Hopefully there won't be a US military intervention or even an all-out war, because that wouldn't help anyone, especially the Venezuelan people. The best outcome from this would be Maduro peacefully stepping down from his position, but the chances of that happening are unfortunately very small. Now, let's listen to Ben Shapiro giving his take on the whole situation and explaining how socialism destroyed the Venezuelan economy, even though Venezuela is the oil-richest country in the world, and how the same thing could happen in the United States and every other country if we get a socialist economy.
In Venezuela, literally hundreds of thousands of people marching on the streets of Venezuela. It's astonishing. The pictures are just incredible. Here's a picture from Caracas, Venezuela, the capital, where hundreds of thousands of people poured into the streets in opposition to the evil dictator of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. Maduro, you'll recall, took office after the death of Hugo Chavez, who was also an evil dictator. For a long time, the left loved them some Hugo Chavez. They thought that Chavez was just wonderful because Chavez used the oil wealth of the country to even out income inequality. He was the one who had cured poverty. He's the one who had cured the healthcare system in Venezuela. Well, now people there are eating dogs because it turns out that when a bad person gets in charge of a top-down, centralized government system, they wreck the country. And that happened with Hugo Chavez, and now it's happened with Nicolas Maduro. Here's what some of the footage looked like from Caracas, Venezuela. This footage is astonishing. You can't see the number of people. I was just at a rally last Friday with probably 500,000 people. This is bigger than that. People cheering, holding the Venezuelan flag. The United States has recognized Nicolas Maduro's opposition, a guy named Juan Guaido, as interim president on Wednesday, leaving Nicolas Maduro ever more isolated as he faces unrest at home and threats from the United States, according to Reuters. Long-standing leftist allies Bolivia and Cuba are now the only countries in the region to explicitly voice support for Maduro, as Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, Paraguay, and Peru have all backed Guaido. The United States and Canada have also recognized Guaido, the 35-year-old leader of Venezuela's opposition-dominated National Assembly, as Venezuela's legitimate ruler. Mexico struck a discordant note because the leftist president there, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, said it would not take sides, and they branded support for Guaido a violation of sovereignty. Okay, so this is breaking down really along 2 lines. One is the line that says, no, Maduro should stay in power, and they should negotiate a settlement, and the other is Maduro needs to go. And most of the Western world has taken the position that Maduro needs to go. Your friendly democratic socialists have decided, at least in part, no, you know what? Maduro should stay. Never mind that he's an evil piece of crap. Like a legitimate evil piece of human debris. It's amazing. I'll explain to you in a second how amazing it is that there are folks coming out in quasi-support for Maduro. And make no mistake, when you have hundreds of thousands of people who are marching to oppose a military dictatorship instituted from above, and folks are saying, no, we should have a negotiated settlement, it's pretty clear which camp they are in. Reuters says the telegenic Guaido declared himself Venezuela's temporary president on Wednesday at a rally that drew hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans. He accused Maduro of usurping power and promised to create a transitional government. The diplomatic support for Guaido was a striking move in a region where countries tend to refrain from criticizing each other despite their political differences. Criticism of Maduro has grown in recent years as his government has sidelined the National Assembly, held widely questioned elections, and overseen an economic crisis that has forced millions of Venezuelans to flee, mostly to other South American countries. At the same time, because of all of this, right-leaning governments in South America have risen to power in places like Brazil, because the fact is you can only run on somebody else's money for so long. The same thing has happened in Argentina. President Trump has reiterated that all options are on the table. His administration signaled potential new sanctions against Venezuela's vital oil sector. So who is opposing the move to get rid of Maduro? Well, you got Russia. So Vladimir Putin is coming out against this move in Venezuela. So Russia is saying that the United States should not intervene militarily in Venezuela. By the way, nobody's talked about military intervention in Venezuela as of yet, and nobody is really seriously discussing that. We're talking about new economic sanctions at this point, and again, providing whatever resources to the opposition are necessary. That's not really a military intervention. Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido declared himself interim president on Wednesday, as we have said. Violence has flared during big protests across Venezuela. When they mean violence has flared, what they mean is that Maduro's forces are now attacking the protesters. In an interview with Russian journal International Affairs, published on Thursday, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said Moscow would stand with Venezuela to protect its sovereignty and the principle of non-interference in its domestic affairs. Weird that Russia would do that, because I seem to recall Russia invading a sovereign neighbor specifically on the basis that their domestic affairs were not properly in order. Russia invaded Crimea, and they also invaded Georgia on specifically this basis. So in other words, Russia is completely full of it, as per their usual arrangement. Asked about the prospect of U.S. military intervention in Venezuela, Ryabkov said Washington should steer clear as well. So we warn against that. We consider that would be a catastrophic scenario that would shake the foundations of the development model which we see in Latin America. There is no development model in Venezuela. The development model in Venezuela is to grab all the resources, centralize them in Nicolas Maduro, pass them out to his friends, supporters, and military allies, and destroy the people of Venezuela. That is his program. It has always been his program. That was the program of Hugo Chavez as well, when it turned out that centralizing resources and his populist top-down government was going to fail. When it became clear that you can't just make a country prosperous by grabbing all its wealth and redistributing it, Hugo Chavez simply started paying off all of his political allies to keep himself in power. And this has been true for legitimately years. Now, what's amazing about this is that you would assume that some of the folks who are sort of friendly toward the Maduro regime in the United States, some folks in the Democratic Party, would be asked about such things. You might assume that Michael Moore, who has come out in favor of Hugo Chavez years ago, would be asked about such things. Like, I think, for example, it might be worthwhile to ask Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, the fresh face of the Democratic Party, about this thing. Why? Well, she was a member of the Democratic Socialists of America until the last 5 minutes. She was a member, I believe, of the DSA as of May 2016, when they called on President Obama and the U.S. Congress to end unjust sanctions against Venezuela. Quote, "This kind of dishonest and cynical behavior is an embarrassment to all good people in the United States. For DSA, a group of activists committed to fighting for socialism and democracy in the U.S. and around the world, it is especially repulsive. We therefore state our solidarity with the people of Venezuela and call on our own government to stop its illegal, unjust interference with Venezuela, specifically to repeal these terrible laws and reverse this dishonest executive order." So they're ripping on Obama for being too harsh on Venezuela, the DSA, while AOC was purportedly a member. And so we were sort of all waiting with bated breath. What would AOC say about all of this? Especially since nobody's asking her. Nobody in the media seems it's appropriate to ask. So this morning, just in the last few minutes, she has tweeted out, she retweeted something from a guy named Ro Khanna. Ro Khanna is an Obama Commerce alum. That's what he calls himself. And here is what Ro Khanna tweeted. With respect to Senator Durbin, Senator Dick Durbin came out in favor of Maduro's opponent. Ro Khanna tweeted, with respect to Senator Durbin, the U.S. should not anoint the leader of the opposition in Venezuela during an internal polarized conflict. Let us support Uruguay, Mexico, and the Vatican's efforts for a negotiated settlement and end sanctions that are making the hyperinflation worse. In other words, he is coming out in favor of the Maduro regime. I mean, that's what that is. If you're coming out in favor of a negotiated settlement that removes sanctions and leaves Maduro in power, then you are coming out in favor of the Maduro regime. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, her only comment so far has been to retweet that. Now, when I point that out, there are a bunch of folks on the left who say, well, that's taking her out of context. No, that's the whole context. I read you the entire tweet, and she retweeted it. Take that for what it's worth. I think there's only one way to interpret that, and that is as undercutting the democratic opposition in Venezuela. Because right now is the time to move. Right now is not the time to say, oh, well, negotiated settlement, Maduro has a point, and we can't interfere, let's remove the sanctions. Weird that she and Russia have the exact same position on this. Very odd, isn't it? Very strange. And this is the same thing you hear from the left when AOC is parlaying with all the folks who want to boycott Israel. And then folks on the left say, no, she doesn't support boycott of Israel. She just hangs out with all those folks and forwards their agenda. Okay, how about a straight question that she is forced to answer by the media? Asked repeatedly, do you think Nicolas Maduro must go now?